The last thing I remember before everything snapped was the way my mother-in-law stood at the edge of my hospital bed, her fingers gripping the rail the way someone holds onto something they believe belongs to them, staring at my newborn son as if he were a prize she had waited her entire life to collect. She spoke in that soft, sugary tone she only used when she was about to do something cruel, telling me that real mothers knew when to step aside. And for a split second, even in the mix of exhaustion and anesthesia, I felt something cold press down on my chest, something deeper than fear and older than anger. It was the feeling of understanding that the woman who had been hovering around my life for so long wasn't just difficult or annoying or old-fashioned. She was dangerous, and she was coming for the one thing I would never allow her to touch. Before I ever imagined myself standing in a courtroom with trembling hands, listening to a judge issue an order that would change the direction of my family's life, I imagined something simpler. I imagined marriage feeling like security, like something steady, people in Hallmark movies build in small towns with picket fences and warm kitchens. I imagined being part of a family that welcomed me, that cared about who I was instead of what I could provide, or how well I played a role. But in every revenge story, there is a moment where the main character realizes that the dream they were holding on to was already rotting from the inside, and mine began unraveling the day Linda decided my existence was a threat to her identity. Before I get lost in the details, let me take a breath and start this the way I've learned good stories begin. This is the part where I pull you in gently, where I make you wonder how a perfectly normal woman like me, the kind who buys scented candles at Bath and Body Works, who meal preps on Sundays and argues with her husband about whether the thermostat should stay at 72 or 74, ended up facing off against a woman who believed I had stolen her son and reshaped his life in ways she disapproved. And before I dive deeper, if you enjoy true, unfiltered revenge stories where the villain digs their own grave, one controlling act at a time, make sure you subscribe to Revenge Castle. Here, you hear the stories no one else dares to talk about, and trust me, you don't want to miss what comes next. When I first met my husband, Mark, it was one of those casual Midwestern encounters that would never make it into a movie, but changes your life anyway. We were both in the frozen aisle at a Kroger outside Columbus, both reaching for the same pint of ice cream and both laughing at how ridiculous it was that two adults were negotiating over something so small. We exchanged a few jokes, moved along, and then ran into each other again in the cereal aisle. He made a comment about how there were too many choices for something as simple as breakfast, and somehow the conversation kept going. It felt easy in the way good things sometimes do before reality complicates them. If someone had warned me that his mother would become the villain of my life story, I think I would have laughed then, brushing it off as an exaggeration. Mothers-in-law in America have a reputation. We all know it. We joke about it at bridal showers, whisper about it at work lunches, watch TikToks where women vent about overbearing in-laws who comment on everything from baby names to kitchen paint colors. But Linda was different. Linda was the type of woman who built her identity on sacrifice, on martyrdom, on reminding her son that she raised him alone after his father left when he was little. She was the one who framed those sacrifices as proof that she deserved lifelong loyalty in return. The first time Mark mentioned her, he spoke in that proud, almost reverent tone sons sometimes use when talking about a mother who carried too much weight for too long. She was the type of woman who worked double shifts at a diner, who kept her old ranch-style house spotless, who volunteered at church events, who remembered every birthday of every neighbor on her street. He said all of this with love, and I'm not saying any of it wasn't true, but what he didn't mention, because he couldn't see it, was that she built a throne on top of those sacrifices and expected her grown son to kneel. I met her on a Sunday afternoon when Mark brought me to her house for dinner. The place looked like a catalog for patriotic decor. Flag outside, wreath on the door, family pictures in every corner, floral couch cushions arranged so precisely that it felt wrong to sit on them. Linda greeted me with a wide smile that felt like a mask, too tight around the edges, too stiff to be spontaneous. She hugged Mark first, pressing her face against his chest in a way that made my stomach twist for reasons I didn't understand then. When she finally turned to me, she complimented my hair, my dress, my posture, everything in a way that sounded friendly but felt like an evaluation. I didn't know it then, but she was already deciding whether I fit the role she believed I was supposed to play. In the early months of our relationship, the red flags were more like pink, faint, subtle, easy to brush off. She made comments about how relieved she was that Mark had finally found someone stable and decent, phrases that felt like leftover echoes from past girlfriends she disapproved of. She asked questions about my job that sounded polite, but hinted that she believed women should prioritize homemaking over careers. She asked which church I went to and whether I planned on being baptized again after marriage so the family could watch. When she said the family, she meant her, always her. I didn't think too much of it. Most people in this country grow up with at least one relative who's a little overbearing. I chalked it up to generational differences, to traditions, to her being a single mom who clung to the son she raised alone. But little by little, those small comments accumulated, forming the foundation of something darker, something that would eventually push me to keep a folder of evidence on my laptop and prepare for battles I never asked to fight. The first major shift happened when Mark proposed. He planned everything exactly the way I loved. Simple, intimate, just us on the balcony of the apartment we shared. Fairy lights he hung himself, takeout from Chipotle, because he knew I hated fancy restaurants that made me feel out of place. I said yes through tears, and we hugged for so long that my food was cold when we finally sat down to eat. It should have been one of the happiest days of my life. It was, until Linda inserted herself just hours later. She called Mark so quickly after we posted the photo that I'm convinced she had alerts turned on for his social media. She didn't congratulate him the way most mothers do. Instead, she launched into logistical questions. Had we picked a venue? Did we want to use her church? Were we planning to let her pastor speak? Were we expecting her to pay? Had we considered how many of her friends would need seats, and could we move the date because her women's ministry already had an event scheduled that month? She wasn't asking. She was notifying. That was the moment I began to understand something important about Linda. She didn't view her son's marriage as a partnership between equals. She viewed it as an expansion of her territory. She fought us on everything. The venue, she insisted on her church, even though it was far from where our friends lived. The dress code, she didn't like my chosen colors because they were modern and cold. The guest list, she wanted 30 people I had never met sitting in the first rows because they had supported her through difficult times. When I pushed back, gently at first, she cried. She accused me of disrespecting her, of shutting her out, of dividing the family. And Mark raised his whole life to soothe her tears, asked me to compromise, and I did, again and again and again. Each compromise chipped away at my joy. Each concession gave her more power, and each time I told myself to let it go because the wedding was one day and the marriage was the lifetime that mattered. I didn't yet understand that Linda wasn't demanding control of the wedding. She was testing how much power she could get over the marriage. The wedding day itself was a blur of forced smiles and mental notes I tucked into the back of my mind, not yet knowing they would become evidence someday. Linda posted a collage of photos online early that morning, all of them featuring Mark and herself. Not one included me. Her caption read, "The day my baby boy becomes the man I raised him to be." It felt less like a celebration and more like a declaration. I shrugged it off. I shouldn't have. After the wedding, things didn't stabilize like people said they would. If anything, Linda intensified her campaign of subtle control. She showed up unannounced on Sunday mornings, claiming she happened to be passing by. She moved things in my kitchen to help me stay organized. She wiped down counters that were already clean. She commented on my cooking with that sweet and sour tone passive-aggressive women have perfected. "Oh, honey, you tried. That's what matters." The real shift, one that turned discomfort into danger, began when we started trying for a baby. When we started trying for a baby, something inside Linda shifted from intrusive to obsessive, like she saw pregnancy not as a milestone in our marriage, but as a second chance at motherhood, one she believed she deserved more than I did. It was unsettling how quickly she inserted herself into every part of the process, offering advice I didn't ask for, dropping off prenatal vitamins she insisted were better than anything a doctor would prescribe, and even suggesting names before I had a chance to process the fact that a life was growing inside me. I wanted pregnancy to feel like a quiet, intimate journey, the kind where you hold your partner's hand in the parking lot after an ultrasound or laugh together while comparing strollers at Target, not a competition for control. Linda made it a competition. She watched me carefully, waiting for moments of vulnerability, the way some people wait for cracks in a dam, ready to wedge herself in deeper each time. When I finally got the positive test, I told Mark first, the way a wife tells her husband, with excitement and trembling hands and the sudden fear that everything was about to change. I tucked a tiny pair of baby socks into the lunchbox he brought to work and waited for him to find them at break time. He called me with tears in his voice, and for a little while, we held the moment like something fragile and sacred. We promised one another we'd keep it between us until we heard the first heartbeat, not out of secrecy, but out of self-protection. Pregnancy is a delicate thing, so much hope packed into something so unpredictable, and I wanted to savor at least a few weeks without interference. But Linda sensed it. She sniffed out that pregnancy the way a guard dog sniffs out a stranger at the door. She noticed everything. How I held my stomach some mornings, how I drank ginger ale instead of coffee when we visited, how Mark suddenly avoided beer. She confronted him, accusing him of hiding something from her, and when he caved under her emotional pressure, she sobbed about betrayal, as if we were depriving her of a right rather than setting a boundary for ourselves. After that, she acted as though the pregnancy belonged to her. She sent me articles about how breastfeeding was the only moral choice, made comments about how my body looked puffier, and even told Mark that I shouldn't lift anything heavier than a grocery bag without her supervision. It felt suffocating, like she was trying to infiltrate every breath I took, every decision, every instinct. The first ultrasound should have been one of the happiest moments of my life. But Linda managed to wedge herself between us, even then. She asked for pictures. She demanded updates. She insisted we tell her the baby's gender so she could start decorating her nursery. It made me uncomfortable, the way she kept referring to things as if they were hers, the baby, the experience, the decisions. But each time I tried to express my concerns, Mark stood in that uncomfortable limbo between wanting to protect me and not wanting to upset the woman who had raised him. I tried to stay calm. I wanted to convince myself that pregnancy hormones can make everything feel bigger. But the more Linda pushed, the more I felt myself shrinking. Things worsened in the second trimester when she started making comments about my mental health in a way that felt rehearsed, almost strategic. She mentioned to neighbors that I seemed overwhelmed. She told church friends that she worried I didn't have the natural instincts mothers needed. She framed every criticism as a gentle concern, the kind that plays well in small communities where gossip spreads like wildfire. It made me uneasy, the way people would look at me during Sunday barbecues, tilting their heads slightly as if asking themselves whether I really was okay or whether Linda's whispers held truth. These weren't the actions of a worried grandmother. These were the behaviors of someone slowly building a case, someone gathering witnesses for a story she intended to tell. By the end of my second trimester, I began documenting everything: texts, voicemails, comments, and incidents. I couldn't even explain why at first, only that something inside me told me her behavior would escalate in ways I might not be able to predict. I grew up in a world where women are often gaslit into doubting their instincts, where we are taught to dismiss red flags because she means well. But documenting made me feel grounded. It made me feel like I wasn't imagining things. The more I documented, the clearer the patterns became. Linda didn't just interfere, she undermined. She didn't just criticize, she sabotaged. And she did it with such subtlety that anyone who saw only one incident might dismiss it as harmless. But I could see the pattern forming like a storm chart, the intensity rising with each passing month. When I reached my third trimester, Linda started insisting I shouldn't work. She told Mark I was endangering the baby by sitting too long at my computer. She told me that daycare was unacceptable and that she could watch the baby full time, even though she hadn't asked me or considered my wishes. She behaved as if my future child were a community project, and she was the director. I tried to set boundaries, asking her not to drop by without calling, not to rearrange my kitchen, and not to make comments about my weight or diet. She acted wounded, telling Mark that I was becoming hostile and ungrateful. She didn't understand boundaries, not because she didn't know what they were, but because acknowledging them would require admitting that her role in our lives wasn't what she wanted it to be. Then came the hospital incident, the moment that cracked something deep inside me. I had gone into labor late at night, exhausted and anxious, the way so many women do. After hours of pushing and complications, the doctors decided on an emergency C-section. When they placed my son on my chest, I cried harder than I ever had before. It was overwhelming, terrifying, and beautiful. I wanted the world to stop for a moment so I could breathe him in. Instead, the world barged in, wearing Linda's perfume. She arrived at the hospital uninvited, hours before visiting time, demanding to see the baby. When the nurse refused, Linda caused such a scene that the staff had to alert security. She insisted she had the right to meet her grandchild, arguing that family always comes first, in a tone that made my blood run cold. When Mark tried to explain that visiting hours had rules, she accused him of choosing me over her, a familiar refrain she wielded like a knife. I didn't want her in the room. I was stitched up, drugged, vulnerable, and exhausted. I barely knew where my phone was, much less how to manage the emotional hurricane that was Linda storming her way through the hospital corridors. But Mark convinced me to let her peek at the baby for a few minutes to avoid a meltdown that might get us flagged by hospital staff. I relented against my instincts and immediately regretted it. Linda didn't just enter the room, she tried to take over. She reached for my son as if my body weren't still open from surgery, as if the child I'd carried for months was hers to grab. When I said no, she stared at me with a look that terrified me more than the surgery itself. A look that said she saw me as a barrier, not a mother. From that moment on, something inside me hardened. This wasn't normal over-involvement. This wasn't love. This was obsession, possessiveness, entitlement, layered so deep that she didn't see my child as mine. The weeks after delivery were a blur. The sleepless nights, the hormone crashes, the constant feedings, but Linda made everything 10 times worse. She dropped off bags of baby items I didn't ask for. She told neighbors I was struggling. She told Mark that I looked too depressed to be left alone. She texted constantly, escalating from concern to accusation. Then came the CPS report. That afternoon, when the caseworker knocked on my door, I felt the world tilt. She told me an anonymous report had been made, claiming our home was unsafe, that the baby was neglected, that we argued constantly. None of it was true. I opened the door to a clean living room, toys neatly in baskets, bottles washed and drying on the rack. My son was clean, fed, smiling. The caseworker was polite, perceptive, and clearly doubtful of the report's legitimacy. But the fact that it happened at all made something inside me break. Linda was trying to take my child, not legally, not directly, but socially, psychologically, emotionally. She was building a story, and if she said it enough times, someone might believe her. That night, after the caseworker left, I sat on the couch shaking while my son slept in his bassinet, the glow of the baby monitor casting blue shadows on the wall. I felt angry, terrified, violated, and more alone than I had ever been. When Mark came home from his shift, I showed him everything: the texts, the voicemails, the screenshots, the hospital incident notes, the neighbor reports, everything I had saved. Watching his face shift as he processed the evidence was like watching a dam crack. He had spent his whole life believing his mother's version of reality, and now he finally saw the truth. We decided that night to protect our family at any cost. Once we decided that protecting our family was the priority, something shifted inside me, a clarity, a steadiness, as if the fog I'd been living in finally thinned enough for me to see what had been building from the beginning. I had spent years trying to be polite, understanding, patient, the kind of woman who gives others the benefit of the doubt, even when her own instincts scream otherwise. But motherhood changes you. Something about holding a tiny, vulnerable life forces you to confront the truth about the people you allow close. And the truth about Linda was that she saw boundaries as challenges, kindness as weakness, and access to my child as a right. She was willing to fight for with lies and manipulation. Once the CPS report came and went, leaving behind the residue of fear and humiliation, I realized that I couldn't afford to wait for the next escalation. Because if she had been comfortable fabricating neglect once, she could do it again. And next time, it might be a caseworker who wasn't as perceptive. The fragile safety bubble we had built around our small family had holes, and Linda was pushing her way through, armed with entitlement and a willingness to weaponize systems meant to protect children. I couldn't let her introduce chaos into my son's world. I couldn't let her rewrite the story of who I was as a mother. So that night, while Mark held our son against his chest, swaying gently in the late evening quiet, I opened my laptop and pulled up the folder I had been building for months. Everything was there. Timestamps, screenshots, summaries of incidents, notes about statements she had made publicly, saved voicemails, and even a few videos captured unintentionally on our doorbell camera when she came by in one of her more emotional states. It was strange, looking at the digital pile of someone's patterns, seeing how each small moment that had made me uncomfortable but unsure had stacked into a mountain of undeniable truth. Mark went through everything slowly, reading each message twice, listening to the voicemails with a kind of hollow disbelief. It's one thing to suspect your parent is difficult. It's another to hear her voice telling neighbors that you have married a mentally unstable woman, or to see her type out long accusations designed to erode your confidence in your own wife. He kept running his hand over his face, as if trying to rub away decades of programming that told him his mother's intentions were always pure, always rooted in love. Seeing him wrestle with that realization was painful. He was grieving a version of his mother that had never really existed. I didn't interrupt. I didn't tell him what to feel. I just let him sit with the truth, because I understood that his reality was shifting under his feet the same way mine had shifted months earlier. When he finally looked up, his eyes were tired but resolute. He said he was ready to do whatever it took to protect our son. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like we were standing on the same side of a line Linda had drawn between us. We spent the next week documenting even more carefully. I started keeping a small notebook by the front door and another in my diaper bag, writing down any unusual interaction or unexpected visit. Mark rerouted all communication with Linda to text only, insisting that he needed written records, though she complained bitterly about feeling interrogated by her own son. The fact that she continued texting only added more evidence to our growing file. Eventually, we scheduled a consultation with a family law attorney downtown. Walking into that office felt surreal. I sat in the waiting area, watching a screen loop through commercials about custody battles and co-parenting agreements, feeling out of place among people going through divorces and separations. But when we finally met with the attorney, she listened with a calm, methodical attentiveness that made my spine relax for the first time in months. She didn't brush off my concerns. She didn't tell us to try harder to get along. She didn't imply that I was exaggerating or misinterpreting. She called Linda's behavior what it was: harassment, emotional manipulation, and an escalating pattern that could damage our family. She told us that while courts often favored keeping peace within families, judges were increasingly aware of the harm caused by overbearing relatives who interfered with parenting. When I handed her the binder I had prepared, neatly printed screenshots, labeled voicemails, descriptions of incidents in chronological order, she flipped through it slowly, nodding in that professional way that meant she saw enough to move forward. Her recommendation was to start with a cease and desist letter, something formal, firm, undeniable, something that would force Linda to face consequences for her actions, even if she believed she was untouchable. And that was the first time I felt something small and steady ignite inside me. It wasn't satisfaction, not yet. It was resolve. The beginning of revenge, the quiet kind that grows beneath the surface long before anyone sees the explosion. The cease and desist letter went out the next week. It was thorough and unforgiving, outlining every point of harassment, every boundary violated, every indirect attempt to manipulate or malign. Linda's response arrived in the form of a voicemail that ran nearly 5 minutes long, filled with choked, breathless accusations about how I had turned her son against her, and warnings that we were destroying the family God intended to be whole. She said she was disappointed. She said she was heartbroken. She said she was frightened for her grandson. But nowhere in that long monologue did she acknowledge her own behavior. There was no accountability, only indignation and blame. We didn't respond. We saved it. And it became another piece of the puzzle that would eventually form the picture I needed a judge to see. For a few weeks after the letter, Linda's behavior changed, not because she accepted our boundaries, but because she realized she needed new tactics. She pivoted from direct confrontation to insidious manipulation. She started posting vague messages on social media about betrayal, about children who forgot their parents, about wives who didn't understand what a real family was. She posted Bible verses about forgiveness and motherhood, carefully curated to paint herself as the wounded party. Her church friends commented with sympathy. Her cousins sent her heart emojis. And though I blocked her from my accounts, her posts still found their way to me through neighbors, co-workers, even random acquaintances who asked whether everything was okay between us. That's how small communities work in the United States. The conversations travel whether you want them to or not. Around that time, Linda also began trying to recruit allies. She reached out to Mark's aunts, cousins, childhood friends, and anyone she believed might pressure him into reconsidering our boundaries. She told them I was controlling. She told them he wasn't allowed to talk to her. She told them she was afraid she'd never see her grandson again. The story she told was dramatic, emotional, and completely disconnected from reality, but she didn't need it to be true. She only needed people to believe it. Each time someone reached out to us, confused or worried or curious, we added it to the file. The turning point, the moment everything snapped into a new direction, came on a Wednesday afternoon in early spring. It was one of those unseasonably warm days Ohio sometimes gets, where winter feels like it's receding, even though you know snow could fall again next week. I had taken the baby on a walk in the stroller, enjoying the breeze, letting the sun hit my face. When I returned home, I saw a beige SUV parked across the street. My stomach tightened when I recognized it. Linda. I hoped she was just sitting there on her way somewhere else, but the minute I opened the garage door, she stepped out of her car and started walking toward me. Her face was pinched, her movements sharp. She didn't care that I still hadn't fully healed. She didn't care that I was alone. She cared only that she wanted access, and I had denied it. I froze. Instinctively, I pushed the stroller closer to me. She approached with a look of frantic desperation, waving her arms and calling out in that shrill voice she used when she wanted the world to see her distress. She said she needed to talk. She said she had rights. She said, a grandmother should not be treated like this. I didn't respond. I didn't have to, because before she even reached my driveway, a neighbor across the street stepped outside and asked if I was okay. I nodded, but didn't speak. Linda glared at the neighbor with one of those forced smiles that looked more like baring teeth. The neighbor didn't move. That was enough. I took out my phone, typed a few quick notes about the incident, and later that evening, I told Mark we needed to move to the next step. Our attorney agreed. It was time to file for a restraining order. It wasn't about revenge yet, not consciously. It was about safety, about peace, about protecting the fragile sense of normalcy I was trying to build around my son. But beneath that desire for safety was something else growing slowly, a sense of justice, a need to reclaim the narrative Linda had been twisting for so long, a determination to show that the woman she believed she could push, manipulate, intimidate, or override was not as weak as she imagined. And as we started preparing the legal paperwork, gathering months' worth of evidence, consulting with the attorney for the language that would best outline the harm, another thought crept in, subtle but powerful. If Linda wanted a war, she should have been more careful about who she picked a fight with, especially someone who had receipts, especially someone who was done being silent. When we finally sat down with the attorney to begin drafting the restraining order, something inside me settled into a kind of calm I hadn't felt in months. It wasn't the fragile calm that comes from hoping someone will change or behave better. It was the grounded, steady calm of someone who has accepted the truth and stopped negotiating with delusion. For the first time since Linda began her slow descent into obsession, I felt like I was no longer reacting to her chaos. I was steering the outcome. And once you step out of the role someone has forced you into, they lose the script they've been writing for you. The attorney walked us through every section of the filing, explaining what the judge would want to see, where the strongest evidence was, and how to frame the pattern of harassment. She asked us questions I hadn't even considered. Things like whether Linda had ever threatened to take the baby, whether she had ever implied I was unfit, whether she had ever shown up at the daycare or my work. Each time I answered yes, I watched the attorney's pen move methodically across the page. It was surreal, seeing my trauma distilled into legal language, each line turning lived chaos into documentation that the court could understand. She encouraged us to include everything, even incidents that seemed small, because judges looked at patterns, not isolated moments. So we did. We included the hospital incident. We included the CPS report. We included the rearranging of my home, the guilt-tripping messages, the impersonation of concern to neighbors. We included the parking lot confrontation. Each piece was placed carefully into the narrative the attorney crafted, building a case that showed Linda not as a misunderstood grandmother, but as someone whose escalating behavior posed emotional and psychological harm to our household. While building our case, something unexpected happened inside of me. Revenge began to take a different shape. In the beginning, revenge had been a fantasy, a fleeting thought during sleepless nights when the baby cried, and my nerves were shredded by the constant tension. Something like wishing Linda would simply disappear, or imagining her being exposed for who she was in some dramatic, cinematic way. But now, revenge was becoming something real and strategic. It wasn't about humiliation or shouting matches or dramatic confrontations. It was about shifting power. It was about putting a stop to her manipulation in the one arena where her emotional theatrics would mean nothing, a courtroom. I knew how much Linda depended on her reputation. She curated it like a carefully crafted scrapbook. She wanted people to see her as the devoted mother, the loving grandmother, the generous church volunteer. She took pride in being known as the woman who survived hardship but remained strong, compassionate, giving. She built her identity on a facade of virtue, and I realized that the strongest revenge was not to destroy her. It was to reveal her, to hold up a mirror so she could no longer pretend her reflection was something noble. As the court date approached, Linda intensified her campaign. Her social media posts became more pointed, scripture quotes about betrayal, vague references to suffering at the hands of outsiders, pleas for prayers for a family being torn apart by lies. Her church friends reached out to Mark, asking how they could pray for him. A couple of her cousins sent him long messages urging forgiveness, insisting that life was too short to cut out a parent. What none of them understood was that we weren't cutting her out. She had carved herself out by her own behavior. During this period, she also tried to bait Mark into phone calls. She left voicemails that swung wildly between tearful begging and sharp accusatory jabs. She said she knew the hearing was coming, and she couldn't believe we were dragging her name through the legal mud. She said she forgave us, even though we hadn't asked for forgiveness. She said she would pray the judge saw through our manipulations. She said she had spoken to people who promised her God wouldn't let her lose access to her grandson. She said so many contradictory things that I could tell she was unraveling. We saved every voicemail, every message, every social media post. The night before the hearing, I barely slept. I lay awake staring at the ceiling, listening to the quiet hum of the baby monitor, the soft breaths of my son sleeping safely in his crib. I thought about everything Linda had taken from me: peace, stability, the joy of pregnancy, the ability to bond with my newborn without fear. I thought about all the times she had tried to rewrite the narrative of my motherhood, all the moments she had positioned herself as the hero and me as the villain. She had chipped away at every part of my life, confident that she could push me to the edge and then use my reactions as proof of her claims. But she had underestimated something crucial. I wasn't fragile. I wasn't erratic. I wasn't unstable. I was angry in a way that sharpened me, not shattered me, and I had facts on my side, something she didn't know how to navigate. The morning of the hearing was cold and gray, the sky hanging low over the city like an unspoken warning. Mark and I arrived early, dressed in neutral colors the attorney had recommended, clothes that conveyed seriousness without aggression. I carried the binder with me, even though I knew the attorney had already filed everything electronically. Holding it felt like carrying my own armor. When Linda arrived, she looked smaller than usual, wrapped in a heavy coat and clutching a purse she held like a shield. She avoided eye contact with me, but stared at Mark with a mix of desperation and accusation. She came with a cousin and a woman from her church, both of whom sat beside her whispering in hushed tones. She had chosen her support carefully, witnesses who would reinforce her narrative, women who believed in her goodness because they had only seen the carefully curated version of her. When we were called into the courtroom, everything inside me slowed. The fluorescent lights felt too bright. The walls looked too bare. The judge's bench seemed impossibly large. I sat down with my hands folded in my lap, forcing myself to breathe in a steady rhythm. The judge began by reviewing the petition. Our attorney spoke calmly, presenting the timeline in clear, logical order. There were no theatrics, no embellishments, just facts supported by evidence. She read excerpts of messages in Linda's own words. She referenced dates and incidents with precision. She described patterns of harassment with a tone that made it unmistakable. This was not a misunderstanding or a conflict between personalities. This was behavior that had escalated beyond the bounds of acceptable family interaction. When it was Linda's turn to speak, she stood with shaking hands. For a moment, I almost felt sympathy, but then she began talking. Her voice wavered as she painted herself as the wounded, loving grandmother who had been shut out by a cruel daughter-in-law. She spoke about her sacrifices, her loneliness, her deep concern for her grandson's well-being. She cried at the right moments. She played her role exactly as she had for years. But here was the thing she didn't understand. The courtroom wasn't her church. The judge wasn't her neighbor. The law didn't care about tears unless they were tied to evidence, and the evidence was on our side. When the judge asked her about the CPS report, she stumbled. When asked why she had shown up at daycare uninvited, she deflected. When asked why so many of her comments about me seemed rooted in hostility rather than concern, she had no explanation. The judge took notes, his expression unreadable. In the end, his ruling was clear and immediate. The restraining order was granted. No contact with the baby or me for 12 months. No surprise visits. No third-party communication. No messages through family or social media. Any violation could result in immediate arrest. Linda gasped. One of her supporters whispered something into her ear. Mark put his hand on my back, and I felt something inside me release, a tension I hadn't even realized I'd been carrying. It wasn't triumph. It wasn't gloating. It was relief, a deep, profound release that felt like breathing fully for the first time since the pregnancy. But revenge, true revenge, was still coming, because the restraining order was only the beginning. After we walked out of that courtroom with the restraining order in hand, the air felt different around me, lighter but sharper at the same time, like the moment after a long storm finally breaks and the sky is too clear, almost unsettling. I kept thinking about how many times I had second-guessed myself, how many nights I had cried quietly in the bathroom while the baby slept, wondering if I was the problem, if maybe I was being overly sensitive, if maybe Linda's behavior really was just a difficult version of love. But the judge's ruling washed those doubts away. Facts had spoken where emotion once tangled everything, and the facts made one thing impossible to deny. Linda had built a fantasy where she was the victim, and the courtroom had shattered it. Mark and I drove home in silence at first, both of us processing what had just happened. I watched houses blur past the window, manicured lawns and mailboxes leaning at odd angles, American flags flapping in the cold spring wind, and I felt a strange mix of victory and mourning. Because even though justice had been served, something irrevocable had broken that day. And sometimes revenge isn't about destroying someone, it's about finally acknowledging that something was already broken long before the first punch was thrown. I wish I could say Linda stayed quiet after the restraining order, but people who build their lives on control do not let go easily. Losing access to Mark had been painful for her. Losing access to her grandson was unbearable. Losing control of the narrative, that was catastrophic. She tried everything in the weeks after the order. She tried sending messages through relatives, even though that counted as indirect contact. She posted long, biblical-sounding rants on Facebook about spiritual warfare in families. She left voicemails on Mark's phone from different numbers, thinking that the technicality would protect her. She even sent him a handwritten letter begging him to correct the lies I had supposedly told. We forwarded everything to the attorney. Each message became another documented violation, another addition to a growing record that would prove she wasn't simply hurt, she was unhinged. But the true breaking point came on our son's second birthday. It's strange how ordinary days can become battlefields without warning. I had planned a simple backyard party, nothing extravagant, just a few close friends, some balloons, a grill going in the corner, the kind of American suburban celebration you see in commercials, a bubble machine on the lawn, a homemade cake that wasn't perfectly smooth but tasted like childhood, toddlers running in chaotic circles, the sun warming the patio chairs. I wanted the day to feel normal, not overshadowed by everything that had happened. For the first hour, it worked. People laughed. Kids screamed. Someone put music on their phone. and the melody drifted across the grass like a promise that things could still be simple. I watched my son chase bubbles, his tiny fingers popping them with gleeful surprise, and the weight I had been carrying for so long loosened another notch. But then I noticed the beige SUV. It rolled slowly down the street, paused near our house, and in that instant, my stomach tightened. Even from far away, I recognized the shape of Linda slumped behind the wheel, her hands gripping the steering wheel far too tightly for someone who was just passing by. She had always been predictable in her unpredictability, showing up at times she shouldn't, appearing where she legally couldn't, convinced she could bend reality to her will. She had no reason to be on our street, and she knew it. For a moment, I couldn't breathe, because this wasn't just annoyance or defiance. This was a violation of a court order, a deliberate one, a provocation meant to test boundaries she believed were optional. I took out my phone and called the sheriff's non-emergency line, just like the attorney told us to do. I didn't yell. I didn't panic. I simply stated the facts. There was a restraining order. It was being violated. She was outside our home. Within minutes, a patrol car turned onto our street. The deputy stepped out with calm authority, walking toward her SUV. I could see his body language from a distance, firm but polite, the way law enforcement often is in suburban interactions. He approached her window, and even though I couldn't hear their conversation, I could see her expression. First confusion, then indignation, then something like fear flickering behind her eyes. I didn't take a single step off my porch. I stood there holding my son, swaying him gently as if this were any other moment, because showing her any reaction would have fed the story she created. Mark stood beside me. His hand brushed my back, a grounding touch. For the first time, I felt the power dynamic shift in a tangible way. She was the one being lectured. She was the one being warned. She was the one stripped of the ability to twist the narrative. As the deputy spoke to her, neighbors gathered subtly on porches or peeked through blinds. I could feel the shift in the air, whispers traveling like static electricity. Because for months, she had told everyone she was the victim. She had painted me as the controlling, unstable daughter-in-law. She had framed every act of manipulation as evidence of my cruelty. And now the scene was playing out in the open, undeniable. There was no way to spin a sheriff standing at your window during your grandson's birthday party. When the deputy finally stepped back, Linda's SUV rolled away, slower than necessary, like she wanted one last look at the family she believed she could commandeer. But she didn't stop again. She kept driving until she disappeared around the corner. I thought that would be the end of the day's surprises. But the real revenge, the moment where the years of manipulation finally snapped into consequence, didn't happen in front of our house. It happened inside it. After the party wound down and guests began leaving, Mark's phone buzzed. He stepped aside to check it, then came back with an expression caught between disbelief and grim satisfaction. It was our attorney. Linda had already violated the order enough times, and with a public violation witnessed by a deputy, the judge approved a same-day hearing for modification of the restraining order. In plain English, she was about to lose even more. Our attorney asked if we were home and if we had a moment right now. Mark put her on speaker. She told us she had just spoken to the court clerk, who had given the green light to notify Linda of a formal escalation. The court was prepared to extend the restraining order, increase the restrictions, and note her behavior as willful disobedience. And because this was the second major violation within the month, the court had grounds to classify it as contempt. Contempt. The word echoed through my mind like a bell tolling. Not because I wanted her jailed, not because I wanted her humiliated, but because I wanted her to understand that actions have consequences, even when you've built your whole life on avoiding them. We didn't have to attend anything. Our attorney handled it all. And later that evening, while I sat on the couch watching my son fall asleep on Mark's chest, my phone buzzed with one final update. The judge issued an enhanced order, extended from 1 year to 2, expanded to include absolutely no contact with Mark unless he initiated it, which he had no intention of doing, expanded to include specific no-show zones around daycare, my workplace, our home, and any public area within 100 yards of us. And a warning was issued in writing. One more violation could trigger immediate arrest. That was the moment everything crystallized. The revenge wasn't the restraining order. It wasn't the courtroom. It wasn't even the deputy at her window. The real revenge was the collapse of the story Linda had built her life around. The shattering of her belief that she was untouchable. The realization that the woman she looked down on, the daughter-in-law she dismissed as weak, was the one who dismantled her entire facade with truth, patience, and receipts. She had waged a campaign in whispers. I answered in documentation. She tried to destroy my reputation. I let the law destroy hers. She wanted to take control of my motherhood. I took back control of my narrative. And the most poetic part, she never saw it coming. Because narcissists don't understand quiet strategy. They only recognize loud conflict, and I had never given her the satisfaction of that. In the weeks after the modified order, things shifted in ways I didn't expect. Neighbors who once looked at me with suspicion began approaching me with careful sympathy. Stories trickled back to me, whispers of people realizing Linda's behavior had been escalating for years, cracks they hadn't noticed until the truth was forced into the open. A few even apologized for believing her stories. I didn't need their apologies, but hearing them felt like reclaiming a piece of myself. Mark started therapy to untangle the emotional knots his mother had tied around him for decades. He began understanding how much of his life had been shaped by her guilt, her control, her subtle rewriting of events. Watching him grow into a stronger version of himself was like witnessing someone step into their real identity for the first time. And as for me, I learned something important. Revenge isn't always loud. Sometimes the deepest revenge is giving someone exactly what they earned. Sometimes it's letting the truth take its natural course. Sometimes it's building a peaceful life that they can never again contaminate. These days, when I tuck my son into bed at night, I look around our quiet home and feel a steadiness I once thought was impossible. No unexpected cars pulling up. No texts dripping with manipulation. No whispers at the daycare. No guilt. No fear. Just peace. And maybe that's the greatest revenge of all.